for questions. So later in the webinar, we'll have actually quite a bit of time for you to ask your questions of Chris. And so that's what we'll use there. Everything else we'd like to do in the chat. And so as we wait for folks to come on, if you could just let us know where are you? Like where's home for you? Where do you live? So maybe put that in the chat, and it'll give us a chance to see where everyone is coming from. And partly what I'm doing is I'm seeing, is the chat function working? I don't see anything yet. Oh, there we go. John from Columbia, South Carolina. London, Ontario, Canada. That's somewhere I'm actually going to be in the London area in June. That's Wayne from London. Paul and Vincent from Vancouver, BC. Great. So for the folks who are coming on, we're as we wait for other people, we are just asking folks to just type in the chat feature where they are. Wayne, of details of my trip. Yeah, if I'll put my email address here in the chat, and if you wouldn't mind getting in touch, I'll let you know when I'm going to be there. It's going to be early June. Andy from Williamsburg, Kentucky is with us. As we wait for folks to come on, I'll just kind of go through what we have planned for today. We are going to keep the webinar to no more than an hour. Like, we want to respect everyone's time, and so we'll be wrapping up right around or maybe even a little bit before 3:00 p.m. Eastern time. And Chris will give kind of a brief overview of this book. I have some questions that I've prepared, things that I want to ask Chris about, but then we are going to have plenty of time for everyone to ask questions themselves too. And as I mentioned when folks sort of first hopped on, there are two tabs. One is there's a chat feature where people are putting in right now where they're from. But we'd like you to submit your questions through the Q&A tab, which you should also see down there. And do submit those questions at any point during the webinar. We probably will get to them at the end, or the second half of the webinar, but go ahead and ask them at any time. Bev here from Sydney Mines, Nova Scotia. Yeah, several Canadians.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, Ontario, Nova Scotia, British Columbia. That's great. Well, maybe we'll just go ahead and get started, and we make sure to get through everything we want to get through. Just by way of introduction, my name is John Pattison, and I am a co-author with Chris of Slow Church. And gosh, I guess I even forgot to welcome Chris. Hey, Chris, how you doing?
Hey, John.
Welcome, Chris.
To be here with you.
Yeah, it's great to see you. I live in Silverton, Oregon, and Chris, who you see there, Chris lives in the Englewood neighborhood of Indianapolis, and he's a longtime member of Englewood Christian Church, and of course, he's the co-author of Slow Church. But we're here today specifically to talk about his new book, How the Body of Christ Talks, Rediscovering the Practice of Conversation in the Church. So I'm going to ask Chris to give an overview of the book, and then I'll ask some questions. And then please do, just as a reminder, type in your questions in the Q&A tab at any point. So, Chris, welcome, and maybe we'll just get right into it. Can you give us a kind of an overview of this new book that you've written?
Yes, definitely, John. Thank you all that have joined us. I'm really honored that you're taking the time today to hear about this new book. And hopefully this will be a really beneficial time for you and a great opportunity to think a little bit about why conversation is so important for us here in North America in the 21st century. I'm very excited about this book. It's one that I've been working on for quite some time. Probably started working on it even back before John and I started writing Slow Church. I did a little ebook that some of you may have seen that tells the story of Englewood Christian Church's practice of conversation, a little ebook called The Virtue of Dialogue. And again, that was a very brief and mostly just focused on our story. But I knew at some point I wanted to write a longer book about why conversation was important and how conversation can unfold healthfully in church congregations. So I've been working at this on and off for about a decade, and very excited to get it into your hands, to tell folks about it. So my hopes for this book are a few. First of all, to tell the stories of other churches, and churches including Englewood, but also other churches that have practices of conversation. There is a growing movement, we might say, of churches that are learning to talk together. Oftentimes they come in from different places and start for different reasons, but regardless, they are developing practices of conversation. Some of you may have seen I wrote a piece for Christianity Today that ran a couple weeks ago that tells the story of 4 different churches that kind of all started practices of conversation for different reasons. So if you haven't seen that, I encourage you to check it out. It's a good kind of overview to some of the stories that you'll find in the book. Also with the book, I want to invite congregations into the very life-giving and transformative practice of conversation as we have found it here at Englewood. And one of the things that, as I was writing this book, initially I thought it would be very much like the Slow Church book, a lot of theology, kind of a bigger picture, cultural analysis. But as I was getting out and talking to people about Slow Church, I found that people were asking me or telling me, you don't need to convince us that we need to talk together, but we want more guidance on how to talk together. And so really kind of as I was writing the book, the shape of the book shifted, our focus of the book shifted a little bit to more practical matters of how do churches talk together, and basically 2 questions that the book is kind of centered around. One of those is kind of how can a congregation start to have practices of conversation together? And then secondly, how does a congregation sustain practices of conversation in the face of conflict, in the face of tedium, etc.? So those are the 2 kind of questions that the book focuses on. And what I'd like to do really briefly here is just to take a very quick kind of tour through the book and just kind of go chapter by chapter and just very briefly introduce some of the ideas that I cover in the book. And hopefully, if you see things as I'm going through here that you want to hear more about, make a note of that in the Q&A, and I'll be glad to talk more about any of these chapters in the Q&A time we have a little bit later in the webinar. And so, let's see, here we go. So the book begins with an introduction. The central metaphor for the book is the human body. Our human bodies, of course, to speak of the church as the body of Christ is, of course, a biblical metaphor, but our human bodies have a lot of wisdom for us because we exist as conversations of diverse members. And the conversations that we are in our bodies are not just kind of idle chit chat. The members of our bodies are not just kind of sitting idly by and talking, but the conversation of our bodies is always a conversation in motion, a conversation about the health and stability of the bodies. I think there's a lot of relevance there for our churches and maybe also for other kinds of social bodies to which we belong. I introduced that metaphor in the introduction, and it'll be carried out through the course of the book. Chapter 1, also I should say at this point, the structure of this book is very much parallels the structure of the Slow Church book. So those of you that have read that will find the basic structure of the book very similar. But chapter 1 is kind of a theological introduction, again, kind of drawing very heavily on the nature of our human bodies, and specifically how our human bodies are created in the image of God, and how the Trinity, I believe, and some theologians have suggested, exists in conversation, and how is that conversational nature of the Trinity reflected in our human bodies, and how are we created specifically for a life of conversation, a flourishing conversation with others, other human beings. And so that's chapter 1. So the book is divided then after chapter 1. There's 3 parts of the book. The first part is basically wrestling with the question, how can a congregation begin to create spaces for regularly having conversations together? And so there's 3 chapters in each of the 3 parts of the book. Chapter 2 introduces basically some basic social and psychological dynamics of conversation, things that are very important to pay attention to. What is the size of the group who will be talking together? How do you arrange seating in a way that really fosters meaningful conversation? All various introductions to verbal and nonverbal communication and why that matters, and how we can pay attention to that as we're learning to talk together. Chapter 3, a very important question of what will we talk about as we're starting to have practices of conversation in our churches. What are some helpful places to start, helpful possibilities of things that we could talk about as we're starting to regularly have conversations together. Chapter 4, the last chapter in part 1 of the book, introduces conversational methods. Sometimes when we're beginning to have conversation, it's sometimes helpful to have or to draw upon a conversational method. So I introduced 3 of them here, 3 of them that have been really important for us at Englewood. And each of them kind of are helpful for different sorts of conversation. And some of these may be familiar to you, but the 3 that I introduce in this chapter are appreciative inquiry, which are very helpful for having conversations about vision and direction. Where are we going as a church or an organization? The second conversational method that I introduce here is open space technology, which is really good for kind of exploring broad questions that we don't really know kind of what the lay of the land is, and need to kind of get a sense of that in conversation. And then the third method I talk about here is World Cafe, which again is helpful for having certain types of conversations. So that's part 1, kind of how do we initiate practices of conversation. The middle part of the book, I offer what might be called a spirituality of conversation. What kind of people do we need to be in order for congregation to flourish in our churches? What kind of conversation is in itself a very important practice, but what other practices will help us become better in our practice of conversation? So there's 3 chapters in this part as well. The first of those, very familiar sort of practice to us in the Christian tradition, prayer. And I suggest here that even when we're talking with sisters and brothers in our church congregation or talking with neighbors, that God is always present with us. And as we're talking with others, it is a form of prayer to be able to be attentive to God's presence with us. And I think being attentive to God's presence with us changes how we talk with one another. We're probably not going to be as likely to call people names, to demonize people, if we're really being attentive to God's presence with us prayerfully. Chapter 6, the middle chapter of part 2, is a practice that I call abiding in the messiness of life. Life is always a lot more messy and complex than we would like it to be, and I explore a little bit in this chapter why that is, and really encourage us not to force categories, force neatness upon the messiness of life, but learn to patiently abide in the messiness of life. And I think to the extent that we're able to do that in our conversations together, I think that we have more healthy conversations together. Chapter 7, which is the third chapter in part 2 of the book, is a practice that I don't hear a lot of people talking about in terms of Christian spirituality, but it's the practice of preparation. We live in a consumer society, and a consumer society is often driven by questions like, what's in it for me? What can I consume from this? What can I take from this? And preparation kind of takes all those questions and turns them on their head. Instead of asking, what can I take? We instead ask, what can I bring? What do I have to offer? How can I be prepared out of the very specific and unique passions and gifts and skills that God has given me? But how can I use those to prepare to contribute to any particular conversation? And how can I be prepared to offer and to contribute meaningfully to whatever conversation that we're having? The third and final book more specifically focuses on questions of sustainability. How do we sustain our conversations? The first of those chapters, chapter 8, I talk about cultivating a sense of mission and identity, really having a sense of who we are and what we're about as a particular congregation in a particular place. That will help drive us deeper into a conversational sort of life together, and even conversations about what is our mission, what is our identity, what kind of things are we going to do together. These are all really important conversations, and I believe talking about these questions will drive us deeper into a life of conversation together. Chapter 9 is one that a lot of folks are paying attention to, and it's a really important chapter in our polarized times. But how do we sustain conversation through seasons of conflict, through polarizing conflict, very divisive, inflammatory conflict, and how do we navigate that gracefully? And again, kind of as a companion to the chapter in the previous part of abiding in messiness, how do we navigate gracefully through conflict? And the last chapter of the book, and some of you may have seen, there was an excerpt from this chapter that ran in the Christian Century about a week ago. And I encourage you to take a look at that if you haven't seen it. But how do we have a conversational life together that is more holistic? How do we make the shift from being merely a religious community that gets together maybe once or maybe twice a week and does a certain set of religious things together, to being a community of people that shares life together in the fullest and most broad sense? And I think as we begin to make that shift, it kind of opens up all different kinds of conversations for us to have together, conversations about where we live and how we live and what kind of work we do and how we do that work. So I think that's a really important part of sustaining our conversations as well. So that's a brief overview of the book. I'm going to turn it back over to John. I think he has some questions for me.
Yep. Yeah, I do. And then if folks notice, I posted links in the chat to both the Christianity Today article and the Christian Century article that Chris mentioned. Do go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A tab. Love to hear your questions. But I do have some questions myself for Chris. Chris, you and I have been in our own conversation now for several years, and something that's been really formative for me and for the work that we did at Silverton Friends Church was learning about how the practice of conversation got started at your church. And so can you tell a bit of that story and then maybe describe what a typical Sunday night conversation looks like at Inglewood Christian?
Yes, definitely. We didn't know what we were doing. We kind of accidentally stumbled into the practice of conversation here at Inglewood almost 25 years ago. But in the early to mid 1990s, like in a lot of evangelical type churches, we had a Sunday evening worship service that was almost dying off at that point. Not very many people attending, very low interest and energy in sustaining that. And we knew that we couldn't continue to have that Sunday evening worship service in the same way that we had had it for previous decades. But we were weird and we didn't want to give up being together on Sunday nights. So somebody suggested, why don't we just circle up chairs in one of our multi-purpose rooms and start to have a conversation together. And so we did. And even in that day, pre-internet, basically, pre-social media, definitely, we realized very rapidly that we didn't know how to talk together. People were yelling at each other. People were really sarcastic with each other. Some people left the church altogether. Some people stayed part of the church, but steered clear of those Sunday night conversations. So it was a real big mess. And we started with, in retrospect, we probably didn't start at a great spot. We started with the question of what is the gospel, and being kind of evangelical type folks. That was kind of a question that was very central to our identity, and a question that a lot of folks had really strong and charged opinions about. And so that kind of also fueled the fire and intensity of the conversations that we had. Continued week after week after week after week. And we found that over time, we weren't kind of being magically transformed to all think or talk exactly the same way, though there may have been a little bit of growing commonality in the language that we used and the ways that we understood things. But the biggest and the sweetest fruit of our conversations together was that we were coming to know and to trust one another. And that trust enabled us to do lots of things. As a congregation, we've started a number of different businesses over the years, which I doubt that we would have been able to start or to sustain if we didn't have practices of conversation. And we've had lots of opportunities to do some really exciting things here in our neighborhood, and to be engaged with our neighbors in conversations. And we were well prepared to participate in those conversations because we had our own kind of internal practices of conversation as a church. And now you ask about kind of the dynamics of it.
What's a typical Sunday night?
Yeah. Typically we have 50 to 70 people, and we sit in a circle. Actually, now we're probably big enough that we need to sit in 2 concentric circles of chairs. But we think the circular format is really important for most of the people to be able to see everybody else in the room, and to see facial expressions and body language and that sort of thing. Sociologically, it's probably way too large of a group. There are times when people aren't able to contribute to the conversation as they might want to, just for lack of time. But sometimes we mitigate that a little bit by breaking into smaller groups, and that way everybody can definitely speak what's on their mind, and then the small groups come back together into the larger conversation. We're a little hesitant to do small groups all the time because we don't want them to fragment. We want to have some unity and cohesion as a church together in our conversations. And that's kind of, even though it's kind of sociologically a little bit weird and some of the dynamics are a little bit weird, we really do appreciate having a space in which we can all come together and all participate in conversation together. And we also have a facilitator that kind of gets us started each time. Remember, we always have a specific topic or question. We usually try to make people aware of that ahead of time. And so the facilitator will remind us what we're talking about, and oftentimes it will involve kind of reminding us what we talked about the previous week and where we left off. And then conversation kind of takes off from there, and the facilitator's role is often to keep us on track as we are talking together, make sure things that don't get too far afield. Sometimes it's helpful to explore tangents, but if you follow those for too long, you can find that you're kind of not talking about what you had intended to talk about. So facilitators sometimes can kind of shift the group back onto the topic at hand. So those are some of the dynamics. I'm glad to, if people have specific questions related to that, I'm glad to talk more about it in the Q&A time.
And just to make clear, you're virtually meeting, you're not meeting virtually, but you're essentially meeting every single week, right?
Yes.
This is part of your weekly rhythm.
Yeah, just as we would gather weekly for worship, we also gather weekly for conversation. And in fact, one of the things that we've done in the last couple years is that we've shifted our time of conversation from Sunday nights, where it was for 20-something years beforehand, up to Sunday mornings right after our worship service, which allows some of the older people in our congregation and maybe some others too, that didn't have the capability or the willingness to come back in the evenings to participate in the conversation because they're already there on Sunday mornings. And we did see a little bit of a bump in the size of the congregation when we shifted it from Sunday nights to Sunday mornings.
So you mentioned that when your church first started talking together 25 years ago, the question that you started with was a big one. What is the gospel?
Mm-hmm.
Do you make recommendations in the book for churches that are just beginning practices of conversation? What kind of topics do you recommend that churches tackle first?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of things that churches could tackle. One, I think this was actually your experience, and maybe you want to talk about it more for a second, but one helpful conversation, if you're anticipating kind of committing yourselves to regular practices of conversation, one of the early conversations might be, how do we want to talk together? What are some ground rules for how we want to talk gently and in the way of Christ together? So one of the earliest conversations might be, how do we want to talk together, and what things are we going to commit ourselves to in order to facilitate Christ-like conversations? Do you want to say maybe?
Yeah, I'll just mention that you're right. That is where we started at Silverton Friends Church, and we came up with 12 or 13 values, and we would start every single one of our conversations in by like taking turns reading those values, going around. They kind of shifted it just a tiny bit over time. We added a couple, but I believe they are listed in one of the appendices in your book.
Yeah, they are.
That was a great place for us to start. Yeah, good recommendation.
I mean, and other things, certainly one familiar thing is just to talk about the text that's preached on that week. It's good, I think, for more than just the person who's preaching to engage the text and to really think seriously about what that particular passage might mean for the life of our particular congregation. So that, again, in chapter 2 is the chapter in which I kind of explore a number of different things that churches could talk about as they begin practices of conversation. And then that's one of them. Another possible topic, and this kind of goes to the chapter later in the book about mission and identity, but what are the things that we do together as a church already, and what's going well, and how can we help those things that are going well to flourish even more, and maybe what things are we wanting to do but struggling to do them, and how again there needs to be some care in having those conversations, that we're not kind of pointing fingers at people about things that may not be going as well as we would hope they were going. So we need to have some grace in those types of conversations, but it's good to reflect on the various sorts of things that we do together as a congregation, and to imagine how we might be able to do those things better and in more Christ-like ways.
That's great. You know, in the chat, as folks were introducing themselves, Shannon from Calgary said that she's here. I assume Shannon is a she. Sorry, I hope I got that right. Shannon Mang and 3 lay folks from Living Spirit United Church in Calgary, and that reminded me of a question that we didn't get to in our last webinar, but I think is interesting. Can you talk about why it's important that conversations are happening not just, with leadership, but involve lay people as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the body metaphor is as great an argument for that. In our human bodies, there are no extraneous parts. All parts of our body work together for the health and well-being of the body. And certainly, again, this is part of the shift. I talked, as I was kind of overviewing the book, about the challenges of living in a consumer society. And part of living in a consumer society is this notion that we participate in churches as more passive consumers. And I think the practice of conversation really aims to turn that on its head, not necessarily to, hopefully not to do violence to those in our congregations that might only want for the time being at least to be passive consumers, but really challenging all of us not to be passive consumers, but to actively participate in the life of the church, and recognizing that the economy of God's creation that you and I talk about, John, in the last part of the Slow Church book, is one of superabundance, where God provides super abundantly for the life and flourishing not only of our congregations, but of all creation. But the ways in which God does that oftentimes, that we really truly experience God's abundance, is when we all, or as many of us as possible, actively participate, and we bring our full selves and all of the relationships and networks that we're connected to into the conversation, and make those available at times for the life and work of the church. So conversation hopefully creates a space where we can all participate. And again, I really, certainly hierarchies exist in our church and in our neighborhoods. And I'm not anti-hierarchy, but I think oftentimes conversation done well, and I've learned a lot from folks like you, John, in the Quaker tradition about sort of equity in conversation, that a conversation done healthfully is a space where everybody is free to contribute, and everybody's contribution is taken seriously and taken with gratitude, and so yeah, I hope that as we have conversations, it's not just church leaders, but it's a broader swath of the congregation that are participating in those conversations. And hopefully, again, I'm not, I mean, I realize that in most congregational settings, you'll have some people that opt out, that are resistant to participating, and that's fine. You can't force them, and it's going to do more harm than good to try to kind of coerce them into participating in your conversations, but really trying to invite as many people as possible in the congregation to participate in practices of conversation. I think that's the way forward. It's the way forward toward being a more healthy and mature manifestation of Christ's body.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's helpful. So far, I have not seen any questions come through the Q&A. And that's a little bit surprising, just because when we did this on Saturday, we had so many. So I hope the Q&A box is working. If you've submitted something through Q&A and for some reason it's not showing up, go ahead and put it right into the chat, because I definitely don't want to miss your questions. Yeah, and in the meantime, I have other questions of my own that I can continue to ask. Maybe you just kind of got into this, but can you talk a little bit about how conversation fits in with what we talk about it as Slow Church?
Sure. Yeah. In some ways, this book can be seen as a follow-up to Slow Church. Slow Church, I think, is kind of takes a little bit higher level of a look. It paints a vision, as it were, of what we believe that God is doing in the world, and particularly why church matters. Some of you may have heard John or I say before that we very intentionally chose the title Slow Church, not Slow Christianity or Slow Faith or Slow Religion, but really kind of putting our finger on the fact that what God is doing in the world is largely a social reality, as we look at Scripture, that began in the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the ancient Israelite people, but to borrow language from the Apostle Paul in Romans 11, that the Gentiles were grafted onto the olive tree of Israel, and that today our churches are part of that tradition. We are part of this movement of the people of God that God is gathering and using to bear witness to the life and love and compassion of God in the world. So that's kind of the bigger picture that we paint in Slow Church. The note that we end the Slow Church book on, as some folks may remember, was sketching this idea that, or asking the question, what might it look like to imagine church as dinner table conversation? And we only spent a little bit of time with it. Basically, just wanted to put an image in people's minds. And there's actually been a lot of good work over the last few years about practices of churches eating together. There's a lot of more folks interested in practicing or talking about dinner church. There's a wonderful book that comes out next week by a young writer, an excellent book by a young writer by the name of Kendall Vanderslice. And her book examines and tells the story of a number of different dinner churches that are centered around sharing a meal together. And it's an excellent book. I had an opportunity to do an interview with her a couple weeks ago. But there's not a lot, there's fewer folks talking about the practice of conversation. And so that's kind of what the space in which I offer this book. So yeah, I mean, I think that, so how the body of Christ talks in some sense is focused on the how of Slow Church. That conversation is the way that we live into the sort of vision that we described in Slow Church. This vision of a church life that's more focused on quality than quantity. That's ecological in the sense of it pays attention to what's happening around it. It's not just kind of focused very narrowly on particular ends, but it's also paying attention to the ways in which things are done. And then it's also very attentive to the economy of the congregation and the economy of the places that it's in and how resources are shared, and starting to imagine different sorts of economies that are rooted, as I said earlier, in superabundance and not in scarcity. So conversation is how we navigate those dynamics that we talked about in Slow Church, introduced in Slow Church.
Yes. And one of the things that you just mentioned and that I love so much about this new book is how practical it is. It really gets into the how-to, and right along with that, we have questions coming in now, and they're very practical, which I really like. Wayne asked, what have you found to be the essential competencies or skill sets of a good conversation facilitator?
Ooh, that's a good question. There's actually a wonderful book out of the business world called The Skilled Facilitator. And I'm drawing a blank on the author's name. His first name is Roger, but maybe Owens is the last name. I'm drawing a blank on that. But the book is definitely called The Skilled Facilitator. And it, I think a skilled facilitator is very good at paying attention to not only the verbal communication of the group, but also the nonverbal communication, and can have a sense of when things start to get a little bit too heated, or maybe the sort of subtle cues of when somebody might be wounded by something that was said. So those are that's one really important skill. Another really important skill, as I kind of alluded to earlier as I was kind of overviewing the book, I think it was when I was answering John's question about our conversations at Englewood, but the role of the facilitator is largely focused on helping the group stay on track. If we've identified ground rules as a group, the facilitator is the one that makes sure that we pay attention to those. And again, hopefully good facilitators aren't confrontational in helping us stick to those ground rules, but reminding us that we do desire, that's the ground rules are representative of the way that we want to talk together, and kind of asking questions about certain things that might be perceived as not following the ground rules, giving us opportunities to reflect on times when we may not be talking together in the way that we would like to be talking together. So a facilitator kind of can help with that. One of the things I didn't say about our facilitators at Englewood was that For probably the first 15 years or so of our conversation, we had just one single facilitator who was always the facilitator. But we found over the course of those 15 years that that person could not both facilitate and participate in the conversation very well.
Yeah.
It tended to, people tended to defer to him, and it was a him, because he was the facilitator. So what we've done now, a few years ago, we actually have a team of facilitators that we rotate and take turns, which allows all of us, and I do that some of the time, and others of that do some of the time, and some of the facilitators are pastoral staff, and many of them are not. But it allows us to both facilitate, and then on the weeks that we're not facilitating, to participate more freely in the conversations.
Yeah, that's great.
A little sense. I definitely, if you're interested in questions of facilitation, I definitely encourage you to look at the book, The Skilled Facilitator. That was a wealth of resources for me as I was trying to talk about what facilitation is and how to do it well.
That's great. I'm making a note for myself too. Lots of really great questions coming in. This goes along with facilitation. Shannon from Calgary says, how can leaders help individuals who perpetually attend conversations but do not engage in conversations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that's an important practice, figuring out how to do that, how to really create a culture in which everybody feels free to participate. And so there's a number of different practical ways that can be done. One that we've used a little bit at Englewood, but one of our friends, a church up in Lansing, Michigan, that has practices of conversation, they do what they call pulse checks. And simply at certain points, crucial points in the conversation, where they think it's really important to make sure everybody has an opportunity to say something in the conversation, or at least to say, I'm listening, but I don't have anything to contribute right now. They do what they call a pulse check, and they just go around person by person. And again, there may be a little bit smaller congregation, conversational group than we are at Englewood, but they make the time just to intentionally go around the circle and make sure everybody has the explicit opportunity to say what's on their minds. Another thing that I mentioned earlier that we do at Englewood is just splitting into smaller groups. People that may be more nervous about talking in a larger group, often we found are more comfortable talking in smaller groups. This is especially true for us at Englewood right now. We've done different things in the past, but right now, everybody from 7th grade upward, age-wise, participates in our conversation. We found that our youth are a lot, it's very intimidating, I think, for our youth to try to participate in the larger group conversation, but you get them into smaller groups, and they're often a lot more willing to speak what's on their mind, or to ask questions that they might have about things that they don't understand. So definitely breaking into smaller groups is helpful, but again, the caution of that is to really find ways for those groups to come back together, so that the wisdom in each particular group can be shared by the congregation as a whole, or the conversational group as a whole.
That's great. And a couple of things that we did at Silverton Friends, like whenever possible, we would send out a few key questions in advance, because there are folks who process more slowly. They're very introverted, so it gave them a chance to begin a process ahead of time. We tried to leave at least 5 seconds between people talking. That way, because there are lots of folks who are sort of eager to jump in, and that just kind of created a buffer space. And that was really, those things were really helpful.
Yeah, I think especially that first one that you mentioned of sending out questions beforehand. Again, that kind of fits well within what the practice I've called preparation, of really encouraging and equipping people to come prepared to participate in conversation, for everybody, as many people as possible. And again, people will inevitably prepare in different ways and devote different amounts of time to that preparation. But anything that we can do to really encourage people and develop habits of preparing for conversation, especially for folks that do take a little bit longer time to process through things, and I'm certainly one of those people. that sending out questions is a great way to encourage that.
Yeah. Here's another great question. It's kind of a part one and part two. What process is used to discern the topics each week?
Mm-hmm.
And then they're asking, what are some examples of a few of your recent conversation topics?
Yeah, that's really good. Those are great questions. So, I mean, we've done a lot of different things over the years. Sometimes we just focus on a specific book of scripture. It's kind of almost part of the mythology of Englewood that we spent a certain amount of time. Nobody can remember exactly how much time, but it seems to get longer every time that the story is told. But going through the book of Ephesians, 6 months or maybe a year or two, who knows, but a really long time going through a pretty short New Testament epistle. So sometimes we just kind of focus on that. Actually, and that's actually kind of, we haven't done that for a really long time, but we're actually starting to get back into that. We're going to be starting very soon here in the next couple of weeks, a conversation on the book of Philippians. I mean, I think it's important, the scriptural story is very important for us as churches, but also in examining the story of Scripture, it oftentimes opens up questions that are very relevant to the shape and form of our life together in the 21st century. And rather than just talking about topics as topics, because that can be a little bit abstract, and sometimes it can be really inflammatory on certain topics, but to actually to work through the text of Scripture and to allow that to introduce questions about the shape of our faithfulness together in the 21st century is something that we're trying to learn about right now. Other things that we've talked about recently, we've had various kind of youth groups here at Englewood, the ways that we engage as a congregation with our teenagers has been in transition a little bit over the last couple of years. And we've had some conversations about that. We've had some conversations about the ways that we engage with churches around the world, what in some church contexts might be called missions. I think we've actually, one of the things that came out of that conversation is that we're increasingly hesitant about the language of missions, but really trying to talk about it more in terms of global engagement. How do we engage with our sisters and brothers in other cultures and other places around the globe in ways that do reflect both the good news, but also the character of Jesus. So those are some of the more topical conversations that we've had recently here at Englewood.
Great, that's helpful. We do have a couple more minutes, so this is kind of a last reminder to type in your questions in the Q&A box. We do have a great question here from Jack. He says, as elders, we began a conversational group, but with little awareness of what we were getting into. Now we're in the scary deep end of the pool with a volatile topic. How might we back up slowly and get feet back on the ground? I'm smiling because, man, does that sound familiar?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I think for us and a lot of the churches that have conversational practices, it's really helpful to talk about things in real terms and with the real experiences that people on the ground have, and not just talk about it in abstract terms or as abstract issues. I think one of the stories I tell in the book, and I think I also told this story in the Christianity Today article that I mentioned, was the story of my friends at Grandview Calvary Baptist Church in Vancouver. I noticed that there was a couple folks from Vancouver on there, so some of you may be familiar with Grandview. But they had some wonderful practices of conversation, but probably about 5 or 10 years ago found themselves increasingly being drawn into conversations about sexuality and how they as a congregation came from the Canadian Baptist tradition, which maybe not as conservative as the Southern Baptists in the U.S., but still very traditional, conservative, evangelical denomination. But their particular congregation was in a very cosmopolitan, urban neighborhood of Vancouver, where there was a very high presence of the LGBT community. And what did it, both kind of in their neighborhood, but also in their congregation, and what did it look like for them to be faithful to their tribe, their denominational tribe of Canadian Baptists, but also to those LGBT people in their congregation and in their neighborhood. And so that drew them into a series of conversations, one of which involved a particular retreat where they sent a number of people in the congregation, I think about 12 people or so, that were all perceived as, by the congregation, as mature, or very mature in their faith. But at quite a wide range of perspectives on questions about sexuality and identity. And they sent this group away for a retreat over a long weekend, I believe. And they had conversations together, and they actually had opportunities to share their experiences and why, not only what they believed around questions of sexuality, but why they believed it, and some of the experiences that they might have had, and maybe even some of the wounds that they might have borne because of some of their experiences. And it was just a phenomenal sort of conversational experience that they had together. And as they came back to the congregation or presenting the things that they talked about to the larger congregation, one of the people that was presenting said, we may not agree on these questions, but we feel like we know one another. We feel like we have each other's backs, even though we don't agree. And I think that's a wonderful story for me in answer to the question that you're asking, because it is a story of being grounded in real members of our congregation, real experiences that they have, real convictions that they have, and to allow a conversation to take shape around that is a really important thing. And I think that one of the things that I found related to that in a number of different ways, but that we're transformed by our presence with others who have different backgrounds than we do. We are transformed in our thinking about race as we are in ongoing regular conversations with people of color. We are transformed. I found I have been certainly transformed by being in ongoing relationships and conversations with people in the LGBT community. And so it's really important. I think this question you asked is a great one because I think it's really important that our conversations are grounded and that we're not just kind of dealing with things as abstract issues. Sometimes it's important to think a little bit abstractly, but ultimately we need to be attentive to the on-the-ground realities that we are living amongst in our congregations and in our neighborhoods.
Yeah, totally agree. Sorry, something just came through on the chat. I was seeing if it was another question. Chris, this has been really helpful. I think that, we say in the Slow Church book that we believe that churches are a demonstration plot of what we believe God has in mind for all of creation. And so in a culture that does feel so polarized, and even in churches that often feel so polarized, I just think it's so important both for those of us in the church and it just in the broader world for churches to learn how to speak well with one another across our differences and figure out that conversation can be and maybe should be a formative practice for us. This book feels both important and urgent. I asked Chris if I could do a little pitch, which is just to say, I would encourage you to go out and get this book. It's available now. Get it from your local bookstore. I'll post a link to Amazon in the chat if you're interested in buying it. But I just think I think it's really just so excellent. Chris, do you have any kind of final thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, just very briefly, I wanted to follow up on what you were just saying. Although the book really focuses on how we can have conversations together in our local church communities, I hope that the fruits of us doing so are much broader than just our congregations. That as we are learning to talk together as members of a particular faith congregation, that those things that we're learning and the ways in which we're learning to talk civilly and gently with one another are forming the ways in which we have conversations and preparing us to have conversations in our neighborhoods, in our workplaces, in our homes, in the public square in general, all the sorts of spheres of life in which we live. So I think that this book, even though I'm kind of very focused in on the practice of how we talk together in our congregation, I think there's some really significant things that our churches can do as we learn to talk with one another. We can be prepared to bear witness to the sort of conversational life of God in our neighborhoods and beyond, I believe. So
Absolutely.
I'm really grateful for everybody that's joined us. We are recording this, and I'll send out an email later today probably with a link where you can watch the recording. I don't know that it's set up for you to share it on social media, but if you can share it if you're logged on to Zoom. I think you can through your email. You can watch it with other people if you would like to do that.
Yeah, that's great. And we may also send out a survey along with that too, just to get your feedback on this. These two webinars that we've done on conversation, Chris and I have never done anything like this before for Slow Church. We've never tried to interact with folks in this way, and we're just curious if it's helpful for people, if they would like us to do more webinars like this. Certainly I'm going to read the Skilled Facilitator so that I could facilitate webinars better. But yeah, it's been really fun for us. And so if you wouldn't mind just taking, a minute or a minute and a half to fill out that survey and let us know what worked and what didn't, and give us any suggestions for how we could do this better, that would be really helpful. We want to be in conversation with you. This is, in fact, I'll close with this. When Slow Church came out, there were a lot of great reviews and articles that sort of speculated about a Slow Church movement. And what Chris and I would pretty consistently say is that, one, we're not movement builders. And the second is we think there is a Slow Church movement, and it's just called the church. And that our hope really with Slow Church has always been to spur rich conversations around the themes of Slow Church. And I would say the same is true now for how the body of Christ talks. Conversation has been our hope from the beginning, and webinars is maybe another way that we can do that. So anyway, just really grateful for everyone who came. Thank you, and be looking for that email from Chris potentially later today with the recording. Thanks again, everyone. Thanks,
Yep.
Chris.
Have a good day.